Good evening to everybody, and welcome to the launch of Democratic Marxism Volume 5. And a very warm welcome to our contributors and guests on the panel tonight. Ana Garcia from Brazil, who's a professor of international relations at the Federal Rural University of Rio de Janeiro and a visiting scholar at the Center for Civil Society, KZN. Professor Carroll is a professor of sociology at the University of Victoria and co-director of the Corporate Mapping Project. He's the author of Making of a Transnational Capitalist Class. Welcome to you, Bill. Ferial Adam is an environmental justice activist and is presently working on her PhD on citizen science and environmental justice in South Africa's water sector. Welcome, Ferial. Patrick Bond is professor at UWC School of Government. His paper, Luxemburg's Critique of Capital Accumulation, Reapplied in Africa, was recently published in the Austrian Journal of Development Studies. He is also co-editor of the book BRICS and Resistance in Africa. And there's myself, I'm an academic at Wits University. I'm just going to kick this off with a few framing comments to situate the volume and the contribution it's making, and then I'll hand over to our panelists to speak to their specific chapters. And to do this, I'm going to share a bit of a PowerPoint. Okay, can everybody see that? Yeah, okay, great. So, this is the volume, BRICS and the New American Imperialism, Global Rivalry and Resistance. It's decommodified. It's freely available for download. Central to this volume is a questioning of the new BRICS configuration, if you like, in the global order. It does not take it for granted. It does not see the BRICS as the heir to the Bandung tradition of third worldism and solidarity. But at the same time, it provides a historically specific location for where US imperialism is today. At the same time, recognizing that the trajectories for imperialism, transnationalizing capital today are in the direction of global rivalries. And at the same time, inviting its other new form of anti-imperialist resistance. So in a sense, the volume is attempting to grapple with all of these dynamics within a global political economy or global political ecology framework. And I'll say more about that. So our rival in this conversation for analytic stakes is the latest Economist with its headline, The New World Disorder, a special report. And I want to argue that we have a better analysis. We're really grappling with the crisis of new US imperialism and its racializing and ecocidal logics. We are grappling with new forms of resistance championed from below in terms of world order making and so on. Now, this picks up on a theme that was there in volume 4 on racism after apartheid. And in this particular volume, we draw on Du Bois' color line, which was specified for the 20th century, but we see this as a long color line. And we basically attempt to locate, if you like, new forms of racism in capitalism today, systemic, institutional, ideological, expressed through relations of oppression, but also make the argument that particular kinds of Marxisms that rose in the 20th century had a very, very checkered record on grappling with racism and, most importantly, anti-racism. We do not reject Marxism, but we do make the case for a non-Eurocentric Marxism and its importance. It's in that context that we also got to recognize that the deep historical, systemic and institutional racism in the United States is alive and well. And the analysis in the volume 4 is consistent with what we are seeing today as well. But the point about the George Floyd moment, Black Lives Matter, is it's not just about a racism within the United States. What this does do is that it exposes the hypocrisy of the US liberal standard. Um, but at the same time, it also needs to make the leap to understand that the US liberal imperium has also been racist to the world out there. Its impact on the global South, its impact on darker nations is something that even poses a challenge to Black Lives Matter. So it's racism inside the United States, but it's also the racist imperial logic of the US as well. Which brings me back to the volume and the location of the itinerary of imperialism and anti-imperialist thought. And of course, it emerges in the middle of the 19th century as a concept, this idea of imperialism, but it really wasn't a concept developed by Marxists. It was actually a concept developed to understand colonial and imperial power. And it does become part of the lexicon of Marxists towards the late and early 20th century. But what's interesting, and this is what the volume tries to do, is recognize that there's a history to how Marxists think about imperialism. And it doesn't begin with Lenin. And basically, this history goes into important debates, people like Bayer, people like Paul Levy, who were grappling with this question as it relates to militarism, colonialism, nationalism, including things like the Anglo-Boer War and historical moments like the genocide of the Herero peoples, etc. So there's a rich history of grappling with the expansionary tendencies and logic of capitalism within Marxist theory way before Lenin. But you also saw in the 20th century different schools of Marxism grappling with imperialism, updating analysis, nuancing analysis, all the way from monopoly capitalist thinking, world systems, dependency, and anti-imperialism. You also saw anti-colonial movements and socialist movements that also had a perspective on imperialism. The Bandung non-alignment project was also a moment to navigate powerful imperial forces. But of course, that was also defeated. In the 90s, there was a big debate about globalization and of course, where is imperialism? It disappeared from our analytical frameworks, from our lexicon, etc. I remember the Indian Marxist Prabhat Patnaik posing the question, what happened to imperialism? And then, of course, you see imperialists themselves, the ruling elites, the ruling classes, even in the US, the neo-conservative project, calling for the assertion of US imperial domination after the Cold War. You have Niall Ferguson and other imperial historians calling for it to carry its burden, etc. And then, of course, on the left, and particularly amongst Marxists, you see a range of analyses emerging from empire and, of course, what is called the new imperialism debate. And this volume is located in that context. But there's also the whole question of, has the new imperialism brought to the fore a new anti-imperialism, which is a theme in this volume. This volume is dedicated to Rosa Luxemburg, who was murdered on January 15, 1919. And one of the crucial points of departure for locating Rosa Luxemburg in how we think about imperialism is that Lenin's conception of imperialism wasn't original, but it also had many, many flaws. I mean, Lenin did not appreciate that imperialism was also in existence in the proto moments of capitalism 500 years ago. Imperialism was there during British imperial and colonial building. But also he didn't fully appreciate the racist logics of imperialism. And I think this is where Rosa Luxemburg gives us a much richer conception of the modalities, the mechanisms, and the historical conditions of imperialism. And I'm not going to get into every detail of her perspective, but this idea of capitalism needing an outside of capitalism was very, very important for her perspective. The role of primitive accumulation and the destruction of the natural economy, also very, very important and relevant. The role of finance was key to her analysis, and of course, militarism. And this inspired various other Marxists to also work with this kind of framework and innovate on it and so on. David Harvey being one of the more famous, talking about accumulation through dispossession, also building on this framework and grappling with where is the outside and where is the inside of imperialism. Nancy Fraser also bringing to the fore the racializing logics of imperialism and the inside and outside. And of course, Samir Amin, one of our leading Marxists on the continent, who also had his own original contribution to global polarization. So this brings us to the US, and where do we situate this new US imperialism? Well, after World War II, we had a US-led world order based on monopoly capitalism, and it hits a crisis moment by the early 70s. And there's a whole set of explanations for that. Is it declining profit rates? Is it got to do with a politics of crisis within US society? The feminist movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement? Has it got to do with the rise of anti-colonial forces? And of course, the defeat of the US in Vietnam. And there's a crisis moment there where the US is no longer leading hegemonically, and there has to be a remaking of US leadership. Now, for thinkers like Immanuel Wallerstein, this is a decline actually from the 60s all the way down. In the perspective offered here, there's, if you like, not the secular decline, but there's actually two cycles. And actually from the 80s onwards with the neoliberal class project, you see a remaking of US hegemonic leadership, premised on the dollar Wall Street regime, premised on globalizing financial accumulation and so on. But that also hits crisis. And it's not just financialized over accumulation. It is the coming together of a whole set of systemic crises, tendencies like climate crisis, the crisis of the hollowing out of democracy, resource crises, etc. So this is a civilizational crisis. And the question we have to grapple with is, does US imperialism in this moment of crisis have answers to these systemic crisis tendencies? And this is where sort of Trump comes into the picture. Now, Trump, of course, the individual is buffoonish and he tweets across borders and he's transactional and all of that. But when Trump comes into the White House, there's a national security strategy put into place. And what is intriguing is that when you look at this document, it's informed by a lot of thinking that was articulated by Bannon at that time, who was in the White House. But it's also something that's echoed by the likes of Bolton, who has had his fallout also with Trump. So in a sense, if you read this document, it's a reassertion of US domination and leadership in this moment of crisis. It sets up the US as the standard of democracy, although in the context of Trump's rise, you can see it's a broken democracy, it's a plutocracy. It's all about also adjusting the global economy so the US is not just carrying all the costs. It's also about innovation-driven accumulation. It's also about counterbalancing power, so readjusting symmetries and asymmetries of power, and it's really about full spectrum dominance. I mean, Trump passes a $700 billion budget while in office, one of the largest military budgets on record. The arms race basically kicks in with China and Russia. So what seems to be emerging right now is that, Bolton's revelations suggest that even Trump's an unreliable force to see through this project. So whether it's the white nationalist, i.e. Bannon falling out, or whether it's the Bolton neocon falling out, it's clear that Trump is standing alone, but this is the script for US domination. And there are possible trajectories coming out of this. US hegemonic cycle breaking. In other words, it intensifies rivalries with any contender state that puts its head up. Okay, and you're seeing this in the context of dynamics with China. Or another possible trajectory is the incorporation of China into the global power structure. China itself wants to be there. It wants to be part of the G7, and it has been incorporating itself either through the WTO, the IMF, etc. This kind of trajectory will still reproduce tensions, but they'll be muted and managed. A third possible trajectory in all of this is accelerating climate chaos, which is what Trump's carbon capitalism and eco-fascism is all about. And this could lead to fundamental ruptures in historical alignments, even in the US-led triadic bloc with Europe and Japan. It could also lead to a realignment with China and historical allies of the US. But you could end up seeing a US policing zones of chaos using its military might. A third possible trajectory is a full-blooded neo-fascist United States sponsoring, supporting the rise of a new right wing across the planet, but largely about destabilizing its contenders and its rivalries. So, having said that, we have some very important chapters in the volume that help us grapple with this kind of global civilizational crisis, its political ecology, and grapple with very, very important questions. Is the BRICS the counter-hegemonic formation that some vaunt it as? Is China at the vanguard of a new hegemonic sequence? Does BRICS contribute to decentering power only to a degree? So in other words, it's not a full-blown counter-hegemonic project. What about intra-BRICS rivalries and the limits of China's leadership? It would seem that China's leadership is a centrifugal leadership. It's unraveling everything. Does BRICS reproduce US-centered power structures, imperialism and sub-imperialism? Does it advance a global neo-fascism, given the right-wing rising in BRICS countries and so on? Is BRICS a new hierarchy in the global south? Limits, contradictions, what does this mean for social forces from below? And most importantly, popular and working class resistance and solidarity. So we have great contributors who will be unpacking these questions. My final slide by way of introduction is that we have other contributions to this volume that are rethinking the dialectic of imperialism and anti-imperialism, looking at different agential forms of resistance. And here we have Chris Chase Dunn and Samir Amin both contributing chapters to this volume around thinking a new internationalism. Chris Dunn thinking about the limits and weaknesses of the World Social Forum and making the case for building a new political instrument. Samir Amin calling for a new fifth international, but not in the mold of what we've had. Something that brings together movements and parties, is democratic, but also strategic. We also have a chapter here by Keamogetswe Sepato on corporate power and how do we dismantle corporate power from below. And then, of course, Alexander Gallas on working class power and mass strikes, and of course, cultural wars of position by Nivedita Majumdar. With that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to hand over to Bill Carroll to take us through his chapter. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Vish. I'm just trying to find my my own chapter here. I'm supposed to share my screen, but I guess maybe you can't share a. Can you share a PDF with this software? It doesn't look like you can actually.
Maybe. You could try it.
Yeah, I don't see. It's not giving me the option to. I think we'll just have to go without the slides. That's okay. What's that?
Well, it should be there. If you click the share screen option, and then you might have to just go to the last block on the right.
Oh, yeah, you know, I got it. Yeah, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So, so my chapter is entitled "Fossil Capital, Imperialism, and the Global Corporate Elite." It's fairly focused on the question of imperialism and the fossil fuel sector, which is the key sector that powers global capitalism. So let me just jump right into it. I try to provide my own framing comments at the beginning of the chapter, talking about eras of imperialism. So I want to just move to that down here a ways and show you this table. So we can distinguish, you know, these phases of imperialism: an emergent phase that goes back to the transition from competitive capitalism to monopoly capitalism in the 19th century, late 19th century, a classic phase from the early 20th century to World War II, end of World War II, a post-war phase termed Pax Americana, and a post-1970s phase as American hegemony gave way to global governance, broadly speaking, partially integrating high-growth southern countries, notably the BRICS. And during each phase, fossil capital, that key sector of fossil fuel production, has played a pivotal role. So we think about Pax Britannia, it was very much the era of King Coal and of transition from competitive capitalism organized around national markets to monopoly capitalism. The second era, classic imperialism, witnessed the rise and then the consolidation of big oil and modern imperialism, sort of joined at the hip. Within each major power, giant corporations and banks controlled by financial industrial elites aligned closely with their national states dominated the economy, generating enormous economic surpluses that could not be absorbed by the domestic market. Finance capital internationalized a world divided among the major powers, engendering pitched rivalries over control of colonies, including the oil-rich Middle East, of course, as zones of cheap labor, as zones of resource extraction and capital export, leading to two world wars. During Pax Americana, this third phase, oil displaced coal as the fossil fuel of choice, and the Middle East overtook the United States as the leading producing region. In the North, as a Fordist regime of carbon democracy integrated workers into a class compromise backstopped by consumerism, fossil capitalism expanded into every aspect of life and every part of the globe. So began a sharp increase in global carbon emissions. This was also the era of anti-imperialist struggles in the global South and resource nationalism. And the 1970s brought a transition to a fourth era as the Northern Fordist accumulation regime unraveled, while technological advances in transportation and information processing stimulated transnationalization of production and finance. The new imperialism effected a selective industrialization of the periphery, which globalized mass consumerism and its carbon footprint, yet continued imperialism's superexploitation of low-wage labor on the periphery, while collaterally dragging working-class subsistence in the core downward. Concomitantly, in the face of declining US hegemony, the tendency toward collective imperialism toward global governance was further cemented in that era. The era, of course, witnessed the rise of the BRICS. Now, in this context, I map fossil capital's leading 50 corporations as a segment of business still central, of course, in the geopolitical economy. The research literature shows that in the late phase of Pax Americana, a transnational network of bankers and industrialists connected through their interlocking corporate directorships was consolidated. And this network has continued through time. So the network analysis I'm going to be showing you really explores how fossil capital is positioned within that larger structure. Just a word or two about method as I scroll down to the next table here. I begin with the 50 largest fossil fuel corporations in the world, and then in a second step, I add corporations that are as big as they are and that are linked to one of them or more than one of them through interlocking directorships. So the boards are interlocking, same directors sitting on different boards. So basically, we're looking at a network that's centered on the 50 fossil corporations and then reaching out to anything that's any large corporations that connects with those 50 fossil corporations. Overall, we can see the top 50 is split between the investor-owned corporations and the national oil companies, the state-owned corporations. And it's a striking regional differentiation with the investor-owned companies domiciled in the global north and the national oil companies domiciled in the global south. It's really quite striking, as I say. Now, basically, a key factor in shaping how extensively corporations actually participate in the network is whether they are state-owned or owned by private investors. The really central corporations are owned by private investors, and they're located in the global north. Northern-based fossil capital has developed under the control of associated capitalists who form a transnational business community, with investments often spread across many venues. Southern-based fossil capital tends to be state-owned and detached from or marginal to this network of large corporations, this transnational network of interlocks. Turning to the dominant component, or the largest connected network, there are these little networks that I find, but the really big network at the center of it all is this one. And I don't know if I can, yeah, I guess you can basically see that. You know, this is a network of 113 connected corporations, including 18 fossil fuel companies and the companies that are tied to them. And you can see that they divide into three distinct communities. There's a network, is a community of 52 corporations here in the northern or the upper right-hand part of the network. This is an American-centered network. You can see ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Chevron, and it's very tightly integrated corporation, mainly network of mainly American corporations. Here we have a more European configuration in the, this community, but the main fossil company is Total, based in Paris. And there are some Canadian corporations also included in this, like Cenovus, but mainly continental European. And then this loose community is a UK-based network that includes BP and Shell, but also PetroChina and some of the Russian, a couple of the Russian oil companies, and actually 4 Chinese corporations, including some Chinese financial institutions like China Life. So basically, what we find in this network analysis is that despite these kinds of interlocks I've just mentioned, the BRICS-based corporations have not become central players. And what we have is an overwhelmingly northern-based formation of fossil capital and neighboring corporations. So I'm going to try to end the screen share, because that's all I need to really show you graphically. So our exploration of the top 50 fossil fuel firms suggests the continuing centrality of fossil capital sector within American capitalism, a weaker positioning of fossil capital on the European continent, and an incipient alignment of European and Chinese capital, both financial and industrial, and continuing marginality in the global corporate elite of Southern fossils. This stems in part from the history of oil imperialism. Northern-based capital has been the dominant player, as we know, the Seven Sisters, that whole history, obliging Southern states to eventually launch their own national oil companies, which, however, are not immersed in global capital markets, nor in the corporate communities associated with those markets. So to jump to just a couple of conclusions, the network of fossil capital provides a distinctive view of the shifting shape of imperialism. The tendency to view BRICS as the main vehicle for Southern contender states may be a misspecification, in my view, when we consider how regionalized global capitalism continues to be. BRICS is a summit-oriented group based on reverse trilateralism, basically. In contrast, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, formed in 2001, is an actual pact that deepens political and economic relations among its members, which include the 3 largest BRICS and contiguous states along China's Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative is a very important transnational initiative that's completely China-centered. China's state capital complex now has both the financial power and industrial clout to lead major regional initiatives like the BRI, that may reshape the geography of accumulation in the next decade. The elite network structure mapped in this chapter intimates that China may align with continental European capital and only selectively with other BRICS. The situation, however, is highly unstable and defies any hard and fast predictions. In the current pandemic-triggered crisis, we see both a tendency toward global governance and collective imperialism, and at the same time, an alternative tendency grounded in an economic nationalism that renounces core aspects of neoliberal globalization, portending an intensification of inter-imperial rivalry, centering upon the US versus China rivalry. In either scenario, the two pillars of distinctively American imperial power, military superiority and dollar hegemony, will continue to shape events. However, there is reason to doubt continued dollar hegemony, which among other things supports American military dominance by allowing the US to run a permanent budget deficit. The share of dollar-denominated transactions has been falling for some time, and countries aligned with China through the Belt and Road Initiative already form a significant monetary bloc. China's recent blockchain currency, which launched a few weeks ago, is another aspect of this situation, I would say. These developments in the geopolitical economy of finance capital take place within a deepening climate crisis. As major financial institutions divest from the dirtiest fossil fuels, as European automakers commit to exclusively electric vehicles, as the price of renewable energy undercuts carbon, we can expect further shifts and realignments. Meanwhile, dismissing climate change as a Chinese hoax, Donald Trump's retrograde embrace of coal and of fossil capital more generally is a rearguard action that exacerbates the climate crisis and may contribute to flagging US competitiveness in the long term. Although geopolitical realignments may further weaken US hegemony and open new escape hatches from US domination, the climate leadership on offer is not likely to challenge the capitalist growth imperative at the heart of the climate crisis. Authentic climate leadership is more likely to come from below in the form of anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist movements and political parties committed to climate justice. So I'll leave it there, which is indeed where the chapter ends.
Thank you, Bill. We are seeing clashes after 40 years between China and India in the sort of highlands of Ladakh. And, you know, water resources are a big part of the clashes and the militarization of the border between China and India. To help us put some of these water wars into perspective, I'd like to invite Ariel Adam.
Thank you, Vish. So my chapter is called Water Wars in the World and in South Africa. I don't have a presentation like the previous speakers. I'm just going to talk through my chapter, if that's okay. So you know, when you talk about water wars, I think often you get the image of post-apocalyptic kind of images, you know, the movies, you know, you've got those, the ones that everyone's fighting for water and that kind of a thing. And it can seem, using the term water war, can be quite alarmist. Some people would say, you know, we're not there. But I think since the term first came out in the 80s, and beyond that actually, but it has changed. It's not only looked at as in terms of water wars between countries, like you've just mentioned, India and China at the moment, but it's also water wars within countries. And so my chapter basically argues and suggests that water wars needs to be defined in a much broader term. We also need to move away of, which I will talk to later, is that there's unrest and riots as something separate to what's going on in terms of this resource. And if we look at it cumulatively, then we can see that there are wars going on around water. So there are two areas that I've identified in terms of what's causing some of the water wars. And the first thing, of course, which is obvious, is the water scarcity. And I think that is very much linked to quality, as well as the management of water resources, as well as privatization. I think they're all linked. Just to add that scarcity is not something where we know, yes, geographically, we don't have enough water. South Africa describes itself as a water scarce country. But scarcity is also a political issue. And it is linked to the fact that water is not distributed equally. So in terms of the politics and the political decisions around water, people are denied access. So there's an unequal level of access to clean water. There's high levels of pollution in some areas, which is allowed to happen. There's poor management. And then I mentioned there's privatization. Just to give an idea of, we've got this geographic scarcity combined with this political scarcity. And that is causing, that's what I'm saying is causing this fuel to this water wars that we're experiencing around the world. And I just, as a basic kind of why there's a fight for this water is that if we look at our water resources on Earth, all the water, if we just take a bucket and put it in, it fits into a bucket. And the fresh water that is available, like just not the salt water, the fresh water is about a cup of water compared to the bucket. And the amount available for human consumption is a teaspoon. So, and of that teaspoon, then take out 70%, and that goes to agriculture. So that is the issue when it comes to scarcity in terms of how water is divided. There's a definite unequalness, and that's causing some of the tensions that we're experiencing. Just to add to that is that presently, as we sit, 4 billion people lack access to, sorry, my cat's trying to jump in my presentation. 4 billion people lack access, to clean water. We also have underinvestment in our waters. We also have a failing infrastructure. We have a preference to heavy industry. And then, of course, we are lined all of that with vast amounts of corruption. All of that then leads to government saying, oh, we need to privatize. So we don't have clean water. We don't have all of that. We need to privatize. And that is seen as a solution to all of the issues that we are facing on the ground. So for example, the bottled water industry is expanding at such a rapid rate that in 2014, or 6% of global population were dependent on bottled water for their source of water. There has been pushback in many cities and in places. You know, South Africa has a history of fighting privatization of water through the Anti-Privatization Forum. In Jakarta, there's a whole move to re-municipalize local water. And that is an important thing that we are going to be experiencing. So also, what does this all look like on the ground in terms of all of these scarcities, the issues that we faced, the privatization? What does it look like on the ground? And specifically, I'm going to look at the BRICS. So in each of these countries, there are issues and concerns around water that are underplayed and downplayed. So for example, in Brazil, in the northeast of Brazil, the country was going through quite a bad drought. And there were demonstrations in northeast Brazil every single day for months and weeks, and people were dying every day. That was like one person a day was probably being killed in Brazil because of internal domestic national water strikes. In Russia, of course, Russia, in terms of Ukraine and the North Crimean Canal, where they're closing it off, they're also just lining it up with their military. So they're basically creating that country division between water. You mentioned India and China, which is a new one, but I talk about India and Pakistan in the chapter, which has a shared water resource. And India building dams and blocking off the river to Pakistan. You also have internal issues within those countries in terms of the droughts that people have experienced and the high numbers of suicides that farmers have found themselves in extreme debt and have killed themselves. But you also have another aspect which goes through each of the BRICS countries, and I will talk more about that in the South African example, but the aspect of water tanker mafias, where you have in countries, you have water shortages and you have issues of delivery where local government is failing, and they basically outsourcing it in a kind of privatized way to water tankers, who then decide where water will be delivered or not. In Brazil, people were threatened that if they did not vote for a particular party, they would not get water. In China, we know that China is the hydro hegemon of Asia. We see the issues of India right now, and a lot of these conflicts on the border is about water. China also has internal issues and challenges around water, but obviously we won't hear a lot about that. South Africa, which is the case that I talk more about, is the one where I show that the various struggles on the ground, if looked at cumulatively, are a war. It's a war going on. There's a very important phrase. There was a protest in 2014 where a protester was killed, and and his name is Andries Tetane. And when people went to court, there was a placard that really speaks volumes, and it basically said, "We came for water, but we got blood." And I think that speaks about what is happening for people on the ground in terms of water. So in South Africa, what is the state of our water and our water affairs? Water wars. We know that we are a country with good policies and legislations. Our water policies basically says that government is the custodian, and so they do it on behalf of people, and so we all should technically or have a say in how water's rolled out. We know that the implementation is appalling. One of the good policies was that people would get 6,000, each household will get 6,000 liters free. That's a great policy, but it is not done equally across the country. So some municipalities do it and some don't. The irony of it all is that the ANC government in their last election campaign
What's happening? Oh, I think we lost Ferial there.
I'm back. Can you hear me? Sorry. Technical there. I just mentioned ANC government and then I get cut off maybe, yeah? So anyway, the ANC government claimed in their last election that 9 out of 10 people have access to water in the country. 9 out of 10 people. And in reality, there's less than 50% of South African households who obtain their water from a tap inside their home. There are millions of people across that do not have access to drinkable water. And if I can just link this to COVID-19, now, if we look at with the lockdown, where government was saying that wash your hands, wash your hands all the time, where there were thousands of people and hundreds of communities where people were saying, we don't have water. And the work that COPEC has done have found communities that have not had water for 3 years. Added to that, some of the people that do get water are from water tankers who operate exactly like I mentioned previously as water tanker mafias. So not only is there corruption in getting the contracts to provide water, but they're also holding people to ransom. So if the infrastructure is fixed, they are breaking the infrastructure so that they can continue supplying through their contracts and then making money out of it. In terms of geographically, our water supplies are in a state of ruin. Most of our river systems are polluted. We have an abstraction of groundwater, which is always almost unspoken, you know, and it's expensive to drop a borehole to get groundwater. So that becomes the avenue for the rich and the middle class. So you create a borehole bourgeoisie that then can get their water and don't care much about the water shortages that are going on in the country. All of these things contribute and fuel the water wars that have been happening in the country. So we have a lack of access to water. You have an unequal supply. You have privatization in some regards. You have corruption and a failing local government, which is beyond failing. And what you then get is what is called service delivery protests. And this is something that Luxemburg has called the rebellion of the poor. And the problem with the service delivery protest, as its name, is that it's one brush and it's just, you know, that's what it is. But it needs to be unpacked. UJ Social Research, Change for Social Research Center calculated that there were 71,000 protests from 1997 to 2013, which amounts to 11 protests per day. And if that's not a war, then I don't know what is a war. And I think that we need to start calling it more of, you know, the water wars, because that's, naming it anything else takes away from the urgency of the issue. The difficulty with these wars is that there are different battlegrounds, and that's the problem, is that there's different battlegrounds and there are different enemies. So just a few examples. If we look at Olobeni in the Eastern Cape, they are challenging multinational mining company. It's also the politics of the area, and we've had an activist assassinated in that area. We have an area like Soweto where Benchmarks Foundation, another organization, is working in an area called Snake Park, where people are living with acid mine drainage running right through their streets. Then you have the wars against municipal failure. There's an extreme failure by municipalities where wastewater is spewed into our rivers. You saw that last year. You had the Human Rights Commission that held hearings to basically tell us that the water's polluted. Like, no, we know that the water's polluted. So if we look at all of these little struggles and cumulatively across the country, we will see that these amount to water wars that are mushrooming across the country. And we are going to get to a point of no return. I think COVID-19 was a very good spotlight on actually some of the issues that we're going to face in terms of water. And, you know, the one thing that was clear, and many activists are saying, is that if government does want to act, they can. And they did act in terms of the water tanks. But even that, if you look at water tanks, you know, there's corruption, high levels of corruption. So they haven't gotten to everyone else. One tank, which normally costs 5,000 to install, is costing 28,000. So there's something not, you know, healthy. And I think that when you look at all of these things, the protests and the wars are going to be continuing, because I don't think we're going to stop with COVID. We have, you know, we have the economy in recession. We have climate change upon our head, and all of that is going to make this worse, so that this war is going to be growing. I do think that sounds a little bit, you know, worrying, but I think that we can do something, and that's part of the chapter, is that I propose what is happening, what are the solutions on the ground, and where people are doing things to actually make a difference in terms of this war. And the first one that comes up is that government must be held accountable at all levels. The second issue is we have to democratize our management of water and our water resources. And that sounds like pie in the sky, but there are things in place that allow this to happen. So for example, in South Africa, the government did put into place what they called water catchment management forums. And it did include people from communities that were able to talk about the water challenges that they have. I know I'm done. The third thing is to have an activist citizen science, where we have activists monitoring our water resources, not doing the work of government, but keeping watch. And finally, what COVID has taught us as well is that we need to strengthen our community networks. We saw that with the food networks, and we need to do the same thing with the water network. So we need to do those 4 things before to stop the wars that I think are going to get even worse and more lives are going to be lost. Thank you.
Thank you, Ferial. So water is part of the global rivalries we're seeing. It's also part of class struggles on the ground. Call it water wars if you like. But there's issues to unpack there. There's been lots of interesting feedback on your presentation. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Patrick actually, because he's our leading critique of BRICS from below. Patrick, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. I can see on that list of the participants, mostly South Africans. It's wonderful that Vish, you and Jane and your team has attracted such consistent, high quality interventions from your allies here, but also the comrades that are with us, and a few Brazilians I can tell too. So warm welcome. I think from that standpoint, what I sometimes do is exaggerate in my writing work the line of argument. And what I've tried to do with the little 15-minute video now is to be a bit more balanced. You'll be surprised. This is actually for my students. I teach now at UWC School of Government. So it's the sort of, let's call it aspiring petty bourgeois that needs to see the extent to which contradictions are built in. So I do take up the topic of the chapter, which is whether the framing of sub-imperialism is useful. But to get there, it's really good to go through also a claim that the BRICS are anti-imperialist. Let's just see if this works. I'm just going to see if I can do the share screen. And there it is, share. And let's just see if this comes up. Here we are. So this is just starting with the first slide here.
In these slides, we take up another critical part of the context for state resource management, which is lessons learned during the 2010s from the BRICS. The Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa bloc was particularly important in part because of what it could not do to change the course of history by decisively influencing the West, and even though the opposite impression was given, at least in the early 2010s. So how did the BRICS provide hope for multipolarity, albeit soon dashed by both economic and political factors? What specific economic problems emerged, reflecting the BRICS' inability to reform Western institutions? And did geopolitical and ideological tensions become debilitating within and around the BRICS? We ask these questions to help provide more context to understand should South African state resource ownership, management, regulation, and influence have factored in the limitations of BRICS-style multipolarity. After all, right early on, from 2001, this man, Jim O'Neill, then a top executive at Goldman Sachs in New York, suggested the BRICS would be building bricks for the 21st century, and that was partly borne out by the extremely important rise of BRICS in terms, for example, of total trade as a share of GDP, where the BRICS drove globalization. However, in the subsequent period, after 2007, as we'll see, BRICS failed to maintain that momentum and indeed led to deglobalization, at least by this one factor, trade to GDP. 2008 was a very important year economically and politically as the G20 was formed, really in order that the West and its institutions, especially the International Monetary Fund, could have a larger economic war chest to engage in bailouts of banks, quantitative easing, more global effective demand. And that's where the additional countries beyond the G8 emerged. Now, the G8 included Russia until 2014, when the West expelled Vladimir Putin for the invasion, or as he might put it, liberation of the Crimea within the Ukraine. And the BRICS sit within this set of major global governance power brokers as 5 countries, basically in the G20, exerting a certain limited influence, as well as in multilateral institutions, which we'll look at particularly in the 4th module. It was in 2013, perhaps, at the Durban summit, where the BRICS exerted perhaps their peak influence and expectations. As Professor Radhika Desai of the University of Manitoba, one of the world's leading geopolitical economists, described it, the BRICS countries had rapid development over the previous couple of decades because their governments were able and willing to resist the neoliberal model. Once this is understood, the BRICS' increasing coherence becomes evident. They've long called for the reform of the IMF and the World Bank only to meet with resistance. Rather than waiting, they've decided to act. And indeed, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, or CRA, as an alternative to the IMF for balance of payment support, and the BRICS New Development Bank, the NDB, for World Bank-style projects, were both announced in Durban and then launched a year later. In the next BRICS summit, which was in Fortaleza, Brazil in 2014, the leading Africanist Horace Campbell celebrated that the BRICS Bank would challenge the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar and that the contingent reserve arrangement would replace the IMF as a provider of resources for BRICS members and other poor societies. Again, the hype was there, but the reality was different, because the BRICS Bank ultimately was mainly using US dollars and not doing anything particularly different than the World Bank did. The contingent reserve arrangement fit tightly within the IMF, and in Module 4 we'll pick up some of the details about why these aren't particularly impressive challenges to Washington. Walton Bello, one of the great Asian political economists, though, felt in 2014 that this represented an economic alliance posing a challenge to the global status quo, because at about $100 billion of capital each for the NDB, the CRA, both institutions aim to break the global North's chokehold on finance and development. And yet in reality, if you look at the leadership battles that went on in the Bretton Woods institutions, the BRICS then played no role whatsoever after 2012. But with a bloc like the BRICS, the rhetorical challenges to the West, that was always tempting. And Jacob Zuma, South Africa's president from 2009 to 18, said, when he was speaking to his African National Congress cadres in 2017, quote, "The agency is part of the global anti-imperialist movement. We're historically connected with the countries of the South, and therefore South-South cooperation such as BRICS is primary for our movement." Zuma also alleged that as he was bringing South Africa into the BRICS, the West was unhappy. So, quote, "I was poisoned and almost died." Samir Amin, the African political economist, had by 2015 identified these ambiguities in relation to imperialism, because Western imperialism, he said, walks on 2 legs. The economic leg, which is globalized neoliberalism as the exclusive possible economic policy. The political leg, which are continuous interventions, including preemptive wars. In response, as Samir Amin put it, some countries of the South, such as the BRICS, at best walk on only one leg. They reject the geopolitics of imperialism, but accept economic neoliberalism. Another version of what can sometimes be described as top left, walk right. Vijay Prashad had once supported the BRICS, and he had thought that over the course of the past decade, he said in 2018, that they had tried to provide alternative institutional frameworks for trade and development. But they didn't succeed. The drive to create an alternative ratings agencies to Moody's and Standard & Poor's didn't really take off, nor did alternatives to the SWIFT banking wire service. And he said, quote, "Now that several right-wing countries have emerged within the BRICS bloc, that is in India, in Brazil, and South Africa as well, these are right-of-center governments as far as economic policy is concerned. None of them really has the appetite to drive an agenda against US dominance over trade institutions, over development institutions." And the schizophrenia is probably best identified and personalized in 2 of the 5 BRICS leaders, Narendra Modi and Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro, for example, was happy to be called the Trump of the tropics after his 2018 election. And in early 2019, he bonded with Donald Trump, as he said, because Brazil and the United States are tied by the guarantee of liberty, respect for traditional family, the fear of God, our creator, against gender identity, political correctness, and fake news. And President Trump rewarded him by promising that he would try to bring Brazil into NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which has traditionally been the West's major military base. Likewise, Narendra Modi and Donald Trump shared mass rallies in Texas and in Gujarat in 2019, 2020, but something happened that was quite revealing in April of 2020 during the COVID-19 crisis, because the Indians decided to put a ban on the export of hydroxychloroquine, which is what Donald Trump thinks is a medicine to combat COVID-19. Trump wasn't too happy with this, the Indian media reported. And he said, quote, "I spoke to Modi on Sunday morning and I said, we appreciate it that you're allowing our supply of hydroxychloroquine to come out. If he doesn't allow it to come out, that would be okay, but of course there may be retaliation. Why wouldn't there be?" And then hours later, the Modi government relaxed the ban on the drug. It seemed like India had made its way into Trump's good books once again, as the US president tweeted, showering praises on Modi and thanked the Indians for relaxing the ban. And here's a visualization of that political schizophrenia, because while Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin had extreme hostilities with the US, and South Africans under Cyril Ramaphosa on and off hostilities as well, Bolsonaro and Modi were very strong allies of Donald Trump. And the denouement, as Jair Bolsonaro hosted a very uneventful BRICS chairing in 2019, was the comparison to Lula da Silva in the 2000s and Dilma Rousseff in the early 2010s, with Celso Amorim, their foreign minister, driving a much more ambitious agenda for a more progressive global balance of forces. And by 2020, there was no chance of that whatsoever. Another aspect of this schizophrenia is the divergent ways in which the economies are performing. And you can see that in the currencies in relation to the US dollar. 3 of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, and South Africa, have collapsed since, say, 2012, 13, 14, only beginning to come back a bit in 2016, 17, but falling again. Whereas India and China are high-growth economies whose currencies have strengthened against the US dollar. So 2 BRICS had very high growth, and 3 were actually rated junk by the Western credit rating agencies. The 2 high-growth BRICS, China and India, have a great deal of conflict underway we're going to explore. In fact, the BRICS in general, and in particular those connected to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's $10 trillion attempt to expand its infrastructure and trade routes, these create tensions, such as in the South China Sea, where building new islands has earned the wrath of neighboring countries, especially Vietnam, but also US hostility. We'll look at Pakistan shortly. But in Iran, again, the United States is declaring effectively a war, sanctions especially, and China and Russia are supporting Tehran. In Syria, the Assad regime has been kept going by Moscow's help, and that's created, again, many conflicts with the United States. And then in Ukraine, where the invasion or liberation of the Crimea created such tensions for Vladimir Putin. These are just some of the sites of geopolitical tensions and often hotspots breaking out that we need to be aware of. And no more so than in the area between India and China that links Doklam, Lipolek, and Kashmir. These are important sites where 3 additional countries are being drawn into the conflicts: Bhutan, Nepal, and Pakistan. We'll look at Kashmir in a minute and Lipolek. We'll start in Doklam, which is a contested area in Bhutan, where, as you see in the photograph, Chinese and Indian soldiers have stood up against each other, and in fact even had fisticuffs in 2017. Luckily, conflict was avoided. Moving west in 2020, another border dispute linking India and China, this one mostly to do with Nepal and its concern about an Indian road in Lipolek. And this is part of the contestation that also entails Tibet, and most importantly, Jammu and Kashmir. Kashmir is effectively a concentration camp from 2019 when Narendra Modi suspended all human and civil political rights there. And the concern is China's use of some of the Pakistani area to invest in massive infrastructure. The rift between China and India involving also Pakistan became acute in 2017, as Suhasini Haidar wrote in The Hindu. Quote, India's main objection is on the principle that the Belt and Road Initiative includes projects in the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And as she said, this includes projects in land they claim belongs to India. The projects could push smaller countries on the road into a crushing debt cycle, destroy the ecology, and disrupt local communities. These are concerns that continue to come back when major BRICS mega projects are discussed. And thirdly, China's agenda was unclear with the implied accusation that this was more about enhancing its political influence, not just physical networks. Now, this also became a factor in the BRICS because in the Goa summit in 2016, China and Russia rejected an attempt by Narendra Modi to accuse Pakistan and its proxies of being terrorists. And Modi nearly didn't even go to the GMN BRICS summit in 2017. Modi even went to visit Shinzo Abe, the Japanese prime minister, in 2017 to set up what they call the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor as an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is ironic within the context of BRICS because South Africa had intended on playing the gateway to Africa function. So here we've got yet more examples of the sorts of contradictions, geopolitical and economic self-interest, that can divide the BRICS if they're not careful. But finally, we'll conclude this lecture by thinking through how the BRICS have often claimed to be an alternative to the unilateral order during an era of deglobalization. The symmetry of the BRICS has created an image of a rival bloc to the US-led Western Bloc, according to Vishwas Satgar, professor of international relations at WITS, whose new book, BRICS and the New American Imperialism, is free for downloading. But Satgar asks, do the BRICS have the capacity, institutional arrangements, and coherence to articulate an alternative world order? And he answers, the BRICS rhetorically asserted an alternative strategy to key features of Western imperialism, while in reality fitting tightly within it. This fit works through amplified neoliberal multilateralism, serving both the BRICS and the West, the regional displacement of overaccumulated capital, financialization, and persistent super-exploitative social relations. In short, in spite of what some term the schizophrenic character of sub-imperialism, the BRICS all generally promote extreme spatio-temporal fixes and the predatory condition known as accumulation by dispossession. That's a great deal of jargon, but there's a lot to it, which we'll explore in the next lecture when we come to some theoretical aspects, which then will help us answer in future modules whether is South Africa punching above its weight, or is Pretoria merely a ringside spectator? Join us.
Okay, so if I can figure out how to get out of this. I hope you're still with me, everyone. There we are. And stop sharing. Okay, yes, so Vish, I gave you the last word. I hope that's all right, Comrade.
Thanks, Patrick. Okay, we're going to move over to Anna, so she has a chance to present, and then hopefully we'll have some time for engagement. There's some good questions that have come through to you, Patrick, as well. Yeah, Anna.
Yes. So thank you, Vish, and everyone. I hope you understand me. I'm the only one here who is not a native speaker. So I've also prepared some slides to present my chapter. I have to say, though, that this chapter is part of many works that I have done, me and my colleague Karina Kato, in the last years, concerning all the researches on BRICS and South-South relations, South-South cooperations, and Brazilian FDI, Brazilian investments in Latin America and in Africa. We have done some, actually 4 field works in Mozambique, which is not solely academic, it's also activist work through the Alliance of People Affected by Vale, which is the Brazilian mining company, and that's why we got to the Nacala corridor. Our chapters on the role of this Nacala corridor in global investments and Brazilian investments. And that's how we got to this idea of when corporations operate in territories, and this is intertwined with development assistance and Brazilian corporations. This is a sort of response to private interests, particularly when it concerns infrastructure projects. So we see the public policy's responses to private demands and private corporate interests, mainly in infrastructure and logistics projects in these territories, which is a main part of the agendas of international financial institutions and the BRICS Development Bank and others. I want to share my, how do I do this? I normally don't work with Zoom.
So there's a share screen tab at the bottom. If you highlight, it's in green. Do you see it?
Yes, I'm there. Yeah. It's not going for some reason. Well, doesn't matter. Let me just go ahead and talk to you. I wanted to show the maps which are on the chapter, but I'll just go ahead without showing it. Just to give you the framework of this research and this chapter. The question is that we also pose in all the works is that the extent to which BRICS are capable, the BRICS countries are capable of offering a real alternative in terms of another developmental model, another development practice that could turn to be more environmentally and socially more just. Or if BRICS reinforce the very basic developmental model that we have lived in the last decades, which are based on extractive projects and negatively impact communities, workers, natures. And what we come to say is that BRICS also are countries which developed within capitalism in the last 50 years, the last decades, through private investments from the Western countries. They created and they facilitated the conditions for capital accumulations within their territories. But as they turn abroad, is the other side of the coin of this. They also lead to new cycles of accumulation, new expropriations, and new dispossessions in other regions and countries from the South. That means that BRICS creates new hierarchies within the peripheries, and BRICS reinforce the extractive capitalist model that is imperialist in nature. And then we look in this chapter at the Nacala corridor in the north of Mozambique. In our view, this Nacala corridor allows us to see the political economy of development corridors in general, which connects logistically and in terms of infrastructure, the production and the lives in the territories to the global production chains, to the global value chains. And we have seen in the last decade or 2 decades that infrastructure and logistics are increasingly central to the agendas of international financial institutions, the World Bank, regional institutions as the African Development Bank and the NDB and other G20, the World Bank and others. And also it's central to the agenda of the BRICS and has been also, as we've shown in this chapter, central to the agenda of Brazil. Brazil was, during the Lula administration, a Southern power, let's say that, renewed its interest to South-South relations and particularly to Africa, mixing both public policies in terms of health and agricultural cooperations, credit by the Brazilian Development Bank, and corporate interests, particularly from extractive multinationals such as Vale, as I said, but also Petrobras, and Brazilian construction companies. And what we show in this chapter is that as Brazil arrives in Mozambique, and Mozambique was opening up its territory for foreign investors, particularly in coal mines in the north of Mozambique, Brazil meets actually a web of multiple interests, of multiple actors, mainly Western actors and interests, but also Japanese, which means that we can see a sort of triangular cooperation between Brazil, Japan, and Mozambique very clearly in the Nacala corridor. And this is very important to structure the whole plan of expanding the Nacala logistic corridors, the railways, the port, the airport, to connect Vale's production in the mines of the region of Tete with the port to the international export of this production, with the production of agricultural products in the province of Nampula, in the north of Mozambique, beyond the Nacala corridor. There's also the province of Cabo Delgado, which produces now gas. All of this is mixed within this particular territory and particular interests of these multilateral actors in terms of global actors, the World Bank, the G8, the World Economic Forum, and the Japanese, particularly Japanese actors, the Japanese Investment Bank, the Japanese Cooperation Agency, JICA. I was going to show the map of PEDEC, which is the Japanese plan for the Nacala corridor, meeting the demands of the regional actors, such as the African Development Bank, the African Union, PIDA as a project, NEPAD, the Brazilian interests, particularly Vale and Embrapa, and also national plans for agriculture and development by the Mozambican government. The chapter shows two maps. One is a map shown by Vale connecting the Nacala territory from Tete to the port of Nacala. So Vale, the mining company, is exposing this territory as its field to act. The other map in the chapter is the World Bank's map of spatial development initiatives and growth posts along whole Mozambique. And it shows the Nacala corridor as one of the main development and growth poles of the country. We could not put in the chapter one map from the Japanese agency JICA, which is this PEDEC project because of license, but it shows the same map, the same region with Japanese interests. And one last map would be one provided by the Brazilian Embrapa, which is the agricultural corporation, comparing the Brazilian soil in the western part of Brazil with the Nacala and Savannah region in Mozambique, trying to show that the biome is the same and they could expand agribusiness to Mozambique along the same lines as they did in Brazil. So to wrap up, so the chapter has a lot of specificities and tells a lot about these different actors. But what we see is that the Nacala corridor shows in the territories the convergence of actors and initiatives around mineral and agricultural commodities production chains. It suggests that the cooperation efforts and investments of emerging economies of the BRICS, such as Brazil, have not been able to show an alternative in terms of development, and the opposite of that. Brazil has participated in the expropriation and the pillaging of territories with other global actors. And the whole restructuring of the Nacala territory along the lines of the railway and the port has also impacted local communities and local peasants, has led to dispossession of these communities, has led to changes in terms of the legislation of land use, very strong changes in transportation of peasants and peoples. So transport has been totally changed only to carry coal and other materials for the export, meaning that actually territories and peoples are serving in the end those private interests globally. So we go along the lines of dispossessions and the acquisitions of non-capitalist territories by Luxemburg, Rivalry, but also Saskia-Sassen with this idea of new geographies of extraction. I could talk a little bit about some changes of today's government in Brazil for Africa, but I think I will leave there, and if you're interested, I can tell you a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And this was a jointly authored chapter with Karina Kato. And,
yes, that's fine.
Yeah, but you know, because of time and so on, we had Anna give us an overview. So I'm going to pull in some of the comments and questions. And apologies, we normally end promptly at 7:30, sorry, but we'll allow for a few questions to come through. So the first set of engagements really relates to Ferial's presentation. There was a concern raised about clarifying water distribution equally. How is that? There was also some concern around using the term war to kind of classify, if you like, these resource conflicts. And there was a point about service delivery protests and inclusion into the system. So Ferial, I don't know if you want to, oh, and sorry, Sid raised the question of engineers and water issues. So I've just clustered those issues. Ferial, do you want to just respond to some of that?
Thanks. Thanks for those questions. In terms of water distribution, what happens is that water users need to apply for a license, and then government would give you a license to use that water. And you can use, I don't know how many thousand liters you claim you're going to use, then you use that water. So when I was talking about distribution, I was saying in terms of how government has given out water licenses to agriculture, to mining, to other polluting industries above the residential areas or communities in that respect. So that's what I meant when I was talking about distribution. I hope that answers your point. I agree, like I said in the beginning, is that some people would say that using war is alarmist, but I think that I'm at the point where if we don't use words that are going to actually give the system a shock, that it's going to, excuse the phrase, but water down the problems that people are facing. The other issue is that on the ground, the people who are protesting, if you speak to many of them, they've been like, we've been doing this for 5 years. We've been protesting for 7 years. We need to do drastic stuff. And I think that that's, yes, they're asking for systemic change, but I think that they're at loggerheads with the government, and that's a war going on, or private sector, in some cases. Olobeni, the people there would say to you that they've had a war, a full-on war with the mining company and the mining company's henchmen, so to speak. On engineers, yes, you're right. What has happened, and it's a kind of a cycle, is that you have, over the last 10 to 15 years, our municipalities have just basically been destroyed from the inside. And a lot of engineers have left. So they've gone into the private sector. But also in some cases, some of those engineers are the ones now getting the contracts from local government. So there's, that kind of thing also going on. But I think, yes, there is a shortage, but I don't think that it's to the point where all our systems will fail. I think we can push that back.
Excellent. Patrick, there was a question about the ANC and developmental state, and what does that add up to?
I think, yeah, very little, Vishwas, but I think the better phrase is tokenistic welfare. including, Ferial, let me just fight with you in a comradely way. I think the water policies, and especially the right to water, have been again and again shown to be bogus. And I think that's hardwired into a neoliberal populist rhetoric that comes from the state. I mean, I happen to be a drafter of the Reconstruction Development Program. I think some of those problems really began there because they allowed enough wiggle room to allow, let's say, for example, for water, yeah, as you put it, 6,000 liters per household per month. To me, that's not that much. It's tokenistic in many respects. But the critical thing is if you use more than that, then what happens is the second block of the water pricing and the tariff, block tariff, rises so fast that it actually has the effect of making a poor person's household consumption even more expensive than it was before the free water. I have all the data from Durban where the best data exists, I think, if you'd like. So I would suggest that, you know, one of the dilemmas of the popcorn protest, may I use an insulting phrase like that to the comrades, the popcorn protests that pop up in so many places, it's not really against the developmental state. It's ultimately, like the fees must fall students did in 2015, in particularly October 21, it's against Treasury. And today we had a budget in this country that again reinforced, and actually today, Ferial, you might have seen Greg Nicholson's article in Daily Maverick, where the water war by the city of Joburg and by ESCOM against poor communities in this city is now being unveiled. They're taking advantage of COVID-19 to chop electricity, even to chop water in vast chunks of our working class and poor neighborhoods. So I do think developmental state is a massive talk left, walk right distraction. We just should ban that phrase. This isn't Korea in the 1960s. This is not a Reconstruction Development Program or you know, much less Freedom Charter government. It's neoliberal populist. They've mastered. I mean, they were, you know, experts in Moscow. Talk left, walk right. I don't know if that answers the question. Could I very quickly ask Comrade Bill, you know, it's great to see the company linkages, Bill, but what I really see when I look at climate politics is that the BRICS are sub-imperial lackeys of the West in the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, again and again, especially in Paris, guaranteed the destruction of the climate. You wouldn't disagree. And the BRICS were there every step of the way, right from Copenhagen, where Barack Obama jumped into that green room and joined Wen Jiabao, Manmohan Singh, Jacob Zuma, and even Lula. And they agreed there would be no binding provisions to cut emissions, and it would be weak, and then they'd do carbon trading, you know, no climate debt. And a final question, maybe to Anna. Do you think Mauro Marini, whose work is being published in English this year by Monthly Review Press, Mauro Marini, along with, as you say, you know, David Harvey, Luxemburg, Vishwas did a great little theoretical intro. Is that going to be something from your terrain, the Marini invention of the concept of sub-imperialism, that when this comes out in English from Monthly Review in about 3 or 4 months, his collected works will all be glued to? It's a kind of a welcome to say the theoretical orientation that you described of a developmental state, actually an extreme case of superexploitation, Brazil in the 60s and 70s, applies more generally to the BRICS. Are the BRICS sub-imperial in spite of the anti-imperial rhetoric? Back to you, comrades.
Thanks for that, Patrick. So let's just give everyone a chance to make a final comment, picking up on what Patrick raised, and maybe if you want to speak to some of the chat line, like Janet raises something for you, Anna, about, you know, does that mean there's no extractivism and so on? So yeah, who wants to go? Anna, would you like to go first? And then we could go to Bill and Ferial and end up.
Yeah, quickly to this point of, is there no extractive trade-based development model possible? Well, Latin America is a region where governments in the previous decade have really tried to push extractive industries to, and the revenues coming out of extractive activities going into social sectors, have tried to develop this sort of, you know, pink tide model, which is limited, as we saw. It's not useless. It is important, but it's very, there are many limitations to it. what we say here, and it's also Patrick's point, is that these countries are rising within the framework of global capitalism, which is extremely destroying nature and labor and workforce, and extractivism is one part of it, which is reinforcing mainly all those negative impacts. And yes, these countries are full of, they're rich in terms of resources, as Ferry was saying, water, but also mining, oil, and other sorts of resources. But this is being used not for the peoples in these territories, it's being used for those private actors in the global market. So this is the very point that makes the limits and contradictions of this model. Yes, and the book is great. Take a look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Bill, would you like to say anything? Concluding?
Yeah, sure. Just thinking about what Patrick was pointing out. I guess what I would say is the research that I'm presenting in this chapter it's pretty focused. It's really focused on this elite network. The whole history of this elite network is wrapped up in the structures of imperialism coming out of the North Atlantic, basically. So the network really is centered on the North Atlantic. The BRICS, the big companies that have developed in the BRICS are not completely excluded, but they're definitely on the margins of that particular network. But of course, that is just one elite network. It's a particular structure. It tells us something about imperialism, but other things are important, as in the COP meetings on climate change. And certainly, I would not suggest that the BRICS are presenting a coherent program of climate leadership. And, I mean, I would say increasing incoherence, particularly as the leadership within the BRICS has been changing, like Bolsonaro being a good example of kind of an anti-climate leader. Like, it's hard to imagine a political leader who's less, perhaps Donald Trump, maybe they're in competition with each other, I don't know. They're pretty good buddies, I think. But this kind of dismissal of the climate crisis, denialism really, and extreme orientation toward extractivism and all that that entails, right, in terms of the climate crisis. I think that's obviously happening in a number of BRICS countries, and even China, which is sometimes held up as some sort of climate leader. My last comment in the chapter is that this kind of climate leadership that is entirely harnessed within the logic of capital accumulation, endless growth, extractivism, is not really climate leadership. And climate leadership is going to come from below through progressive movements and political parties.
Thank you, Bill. Ferial, would you like to respond, make a final comment? And Patrick, just pick up on that comment that's just come through around energy policy in Africa. Ferial, go for it. Final comment.
Thanks, Fish. I mean, I think also, when you're presenting on a chapter, you do miss out on some of the nuances that you add into to build a chapter. So some of the comments that are coming through are in the chapter itself. I had to choose what to say. And I agree with you, Patrick. I mean, government has, particularly a very neoliberal and a mineral energy complex focus. And so, of course, they would have policies that are left and they walk right. I just need to say that some of these policies did come out of revolutionary change. So like environmental justice movements that influence the water policies and environmental policies. And the implementation, when it is poor, is actually because of the economic stance that they're taking. So I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I don't think there were any other comments from Vish, but I do think that we need to, like for me, the water stuff, all of this that I'm looking at is part of my PhD. And I do think that, yes, there's an element, I think Janet mentioned about people wanting inclusion. There is that, but there's also a point of people are extremely frustrated and they're losing. It's not about inclusion anymore. And we're getting to that point of significant. They want revolutionary change. And it's smaller in numbers now because it's so dispersed. But if you look at that, as like I said, cumulatively, then I do think that there's a war waging. I do believe that. And yes, I don't like using the terms, you know, it's military terms, etc. But I think that there's nothing else that I think would fit. You know, it's not a disagreement. It's not a minor conflict. It's big and it's water. And if we don't deal with it as such, then we're in big trouble. Thank you.
Patrick, final comment?
Well, it is a great question from Farai Magu. Farai is a leading activist and intellectual from Eastern Zimbabwe, where the Marangi diamond fields, in a way, right, that's the most intense carbon of all, which is the diamond, is utterly looted by Chinese companies working hand in glove with Zimbabwean generals. I mean, don't take it from me or Farai, the leading expert. Robert Mugabe himself said that out of $15 billion worth of diamonds there, 13 billion went missing, right, the revenues. And I think that's exemplary, but typical for what Chinese sub-imperial accumulation systems do. And I don't think energy is the critical point. If so, here in South Africa, we've got one of the biggest gambits of China, which is called the MSEZ. It's basically an SEZ, a special economic zone, between Messina on the Zimbabwe border and Makado, Louis Tricard. And it's meant to be a 3,300 megawatt coal-fired power plant, plus a massive smelting operation, because there's still a lot of coal in that Waterberg, huge amounts. And it's in that kind of contradiction where I don't think they can go forward. There's no market. The price of coal is tanked to, I think it's about $52. The peak had been about $170. It had been 120 not too long ago. So the estimations when they do these sorts of plans, or you know, make major investments in the pipeline that goes to you know, from Uganda and South Sudan out to northern Kenya, where there's been a huge fight at Lamu about that pipeline and the coal-fired power plant. I think a lot of that is all pre-COVID. I think the deglobalization, and China actually doesn't even need any coal from Africa. It's not using any at the moment. It may need oil from South Sudan. It may need, you know, to keep Angola and Nigeria going. But the critical question really isn't energy anymore. My view is that it's debt, it's finance. And that's where a new struggle, I think, has to emerge to take on the BRICS as extreme sub-imperial allies of Western banks. I mean, they're way to the right, China on debt, even than the OECD, the G20. China is not really playing ball. And I think that huge African debt to China, at about $600 billion in debt, which South Africa is about 185 billion, a vast amount. I'll just end with one example. It's now a common cause that the Gupta family with the China Development Bank at Transnet looted the second biggest parastatal. They tried, of course, the biggest, Eskom, as well. Hitachi had gotten there first, the Japanese company with the ANC. But the critical thing will be a $5 billion loan that the Chinese made, both for locomotives to export 18 billion tons of coal, which isn't going to happen, plus a loan for Kusile, one of the, you know, the two biggest power plants under construction in the world. Just to conclude, those kind of contradictions, should we as Eskom customers here in cold Johannesburg, should we as taxpayers in South Africa, should we subsidize extreme exploitation through finance by the China Development Bank, the BRICS New Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and especially the World Bank? It made its biggest loan for this. I think that's going to be one of the great contradictions. Today, Dick Forsland in Daily Maverick had a great piece exactly about this problem. So I hope we can all join together. There are common enemies amongst this fragmented world, and some of them will include financial capital. And thanks so much, Vishwa, for putting us all together. You do such a great job. And thanks to the other comrades on the call.
And a big thank you to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for supporting the Democratic Marxism Series project. And thank you to the National Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences for funding the digitization of Volume 3, Volume 4, and this volume, Volume 5. And we put the links up for those who want to download those volumes. And a big thank you to all these contributors who've contributed their intellectual labor to this knowledge commons. And then finally, thank you to all the participants who made the time to join us this evening. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll also put out a link to this recording so the conversations continue. Thank you and good night. Bye.